Okay, so I didn't get to the closing scene in the last little video I made, so I thought I'd just recap that here and give a little opportunity to talk about kind of that last 30 seconds of the film. It's a weird way to for the film to end, and I've talked about how anticlimactic that final scene of the film is, and I think it's anticlimactic for a really important reason. Whenever we're looking at a film, we always kind of need to ask ourselves why something stayed in. You can find on YouTube plenty of deleted scenes. There's some really great deleted scenes from the Truman Show available online. You can access them through YouTube. And I think, again, they're not useful to us in terms of studying the Truman Show or writing about them in our essays. I do not want you writing about deleted scenes in your essays. But what do they give us is an insight as to what didn't make it. So it allows us to look at what stayed in the film. Why do scenes that maybe don't seem so important, they obviously were important to the director, they were important to the editing team who kept them in and worked out where they go in the film. So the last 30 seconds of The Truman Show is just our garage attendants. And you know that I really love a moment. I really love looking for something in a film that we can talk about that's probably not going to be what everybody talks about. There will be those scenes that everybody universally talks about in their essays, but we always need to look for that one little moment to show how well we know the film and to show our marker that we know the film in its entirety and that we've been looking at it in detail and we've been looking for those special moments. And I think the parking garage attendants give us that edge and allow us to do that quite nicely. And so the film closes with them, and we know that they've been watching Truman. They've been those avid investors. Every time we grab to them, they are mindlessly nodding. There's that moment during the True Talk interview when Christoph makes his big declaration about how we accept the reality of the world with which we're presented, and then we get that lovely two-shot of them and one of them just sitting there kind of slack-jawed, mindlessly nodding in agreement. And it's unlikely that he has understood the full complexity of what Christoph has said or the implications for what that means in his world. But we see that compliance. We see that compliance when they watch Truman sleeping. We see that compliance when one of the parking attendants admits to watching the flowing curtains and his disappointment that, you can't see anything during Truman and Meryl's intimate moments. So again, I think we need to keep going back to what purpose they serve. How do they heighten the film for us? Why did they stay in? And we know that the crosscuts to the real world and the real world mise-en-scène is really important because we do have three very distinct worlds that happen in this film. And then when they intersect, we're meant to understand the three worlds holistically, but we're also meant to understand what they mean individually and the implications that each world has. I've talked about, Sea Haven as this initially utopian representation that grows increasingly dystopian as the film goes. The liminal room with its techno-noir space, very hallmark dystopian. I think it was our friend Alex who recognized the connection between that and the Death Star in Star Wars. This kind of controlling, observing figure, this powerful kind of lunar space. And I think there is an allusion there, although maybe don't mention that in your essays. And of course, then we have the real world, and I've talked more about the insular nature of those spaces, but also the investment. And we know that in the real world, people cover their walls in pictures of Truman. They have collages of pictures of Truman. They have doll houses that are the Truman space. We have the montage shots where we see the couple having breakfast, dressed as Truman, as Meryl, in their kitchen, and even the little globe radio sits there on the bench next to the bowl of fruit, a direct lift out of Truman's world. We know that there's catalogs where you can buy the clothing, and we see even in the Truman bar that people again rock up to that bar dressed in Truman's attire. They have t-shirts with Truman on them. There's all the hallmarks, and that paraphernalia and that memorabilia that would be found in a sports bar is replaced by the memorabilia and paraphernalia of the Truman Show. So there's those distinct worlds. So we don't see that as much in the parking garage attendant space, but what we do see are two characters that we wouldn't normally associate as being really interested in Truman's world. They seem to be characters that we wouldn't think would be interested in that, but of course they are incredibly compliant, invested, very much those mindless consumers of the show. And again, I think their role is to show us how pervasive the following of the show is, just how successful big media and Christoph's power, how far it can extend in the world, and these unlikely people who are just like everyone else, and the in excess of 1.7 billion worldwide fans, just how far that reaches, what parts of the world and what parts of the community it's reaching, and why they're so then misplaced in that. So they close our film, these strange men who we wouldn't have thought would be such fans, but prove to be completely invested in it. So then when we get to the end, and the Truman Show is over, we've gone through that very climactic religious allegorical tale of Truman's, him on the Santa Maria, which was Christopher Columbus's ship, finally living out that role of the explorer. And then he leaves. He steps out into darkness. He takes his bow, letting everybody know that the performance is over. And I think also that is highly symbolic, the fact that Truman takes a bow like a performer would. Again, I think we always need to be, and again, asking those postmodern questions of how much of Truman is authentic, how much of Truman's personality has been nurtured, how much of it is nature. I think the explorer is the natural part, the innate human part of Truman, and then pretty much everything else has been carefully manufactured and carefully constructed, and they've nurtured the personality of Truman rather than allow that to develop in any natural way. So he takes a bow as a performer and then steps out into darkness, into the adventure of life thereafter. And again, and feel free to disagree, of course, but when I look at this film, I have this overwhelming despair for Truman. I don't think he's going to walk out into a happy life. And I think that is why the film ends where it does, with those two security guards. We have been led on a journey by Weir to start asking more moral and ethical questions about what we consume as entertainment and what we let be entertainment for us in that world. And then all of a sudden he leaves it. It's seemingly over. Truman has been shown the truth of what the world is and has decided that he doesn't like it. He abandons Christoph. He abandons the experiment. The Truman Show at 29 years running is finished. But then that's not where the film finishes. He steps out into darkness, and had that just have been the ending, maybe we could potentially have a sense of hope. But we have an extra 20 to 30 seconds of film, which is the parking garage attendants. And their response isn't, yay, Truman. Their response isn't, whoa, that was messed. Their response is to ask, what's on next? So if we take this film as a social satire on the way that we consume, on our relationship with entertainment, on our relationship with the media, on the saturation and excess of media and where it could go 20 years in the future, then the fact that they don't get out and go for a walk, the fact that they don't they don't have any kind of discourse on what has happened, that they simply ask for the TV guide to find out what's on next, speaks to the fact that the real world hasn't learned any lessons here. That is the heart of the satire, is that we are mindless consumers. Our relationship with the media has gone too far. We're so saturated by it. It's like an addiction, and the fact that we jump from one thing to the next. I think their nonchalant attitude as well. I mean, I think if I'd invested 30 years into something, I would probably show more emotion when it was finished. They don't. They're just so ready to move on and find out what the next craze is. And I think that's where the heart of the despair comes from, because all of a sudden you have this crushing realization as the film closes, oh, no one's learnt anything here. The Truman Show as a cruel experiment, it hasn't been exposed for its cruelty. We just saw in the bar that they were treating it as a game, and now at the end, no one's having a conversation about it. No one's being self-reflective about what they've invested their time into. They're just so ready to jump onto what the next craze is. And if they could do that to Truman, what could they do to the next person? What is the next craze? And I think when we close the film, we realize that the Truman Show could happen again, and just how cruel it could be for the next time. What do you do to make sure someone doesn't leave that world? And of course, I think we need to always remember that the reason why, I mean, Christoph makes his ridiculous comment about how if Truman really wanted to leave, he could, and Truman really does want to leave, and he does. But he has to nearly die for that. And if we read further into the religious allegory, he does kind of have a death and rebirth before exiting that world, as though, he was kind of leaving the Garden of Eden or some such. But, going back to this idea that if Truman wanted to leave, Christoph is willing to kill Truman for the sake of entertainment, to try and keep him there. He relies on that psychological trauma that he's instilled in Truman. And that psychological trauma is, I think, really the cruelest part of this experiment. And of course, the complicity of everyone surrounding Truman in reinforcing that trauma. Meryl is quite happy to remind him that you can't drive across water, that they send him to go and get the ferry to see a customer just so they can put the skiff that he was on with his father in the water to emotionally traumatize him. The fact that the mother uses that guilt trip to control him and to instill in someone a very real psychological trauma, to control them and to control their fears, he is intensely cruel. And it speaks to that godlike role that Christoph has, and the fact that nobody has questioned whether this is okay and whether this is the right thing to do. It's the necessary thing to do to allow the entertainment to continue and to contain any threat to the entertainment. And then to close the film with the two guards going to see what happens next is a very anticlimactic ending to the film that shows us that no one has learnt anything. And I think that speaks again to the fact that nobody could really pick up what was real and what was fiction. They very successfully and very bizarrely managed to hold that duality without asking any questions about it. They knew, and we know from the very opening sequence of the film that they know that this is manufactured, and yet they've brought hook, line and sinker into the lie about it being some kind of reality. And the media has been very successful in allowing them to hold those two ideas simultaneously and not be disturbed by that. And that's not how the film ends. Anyone going, whoa, I just realized what spell I've been under for 30 years. That's not the ending to the film. The ending of the film is, let's go and see what's next. And what that means in terms of the satire, what that means in terms of the overarching themes about consumerism, about entertainment, about media saturation, I think comes to the fore in those closing 20 seconds. So keep that in mind as you're deconstructing. And again, if you have any questions or if you want to challenge any of those ideas, flick me an email, and I hope the study is going well.